Welcome to Defense Disrupted. My name is Ian. I'm joined by an extraordinary leader, retired Brigadier General Ed Barker. Ed, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Ian. Thanks, brother. Happy to be here, man. You know the deal.
Oh, yeah. We're going to have most for the day. You have seen this national security world from a perspective that is uncommon. Not a lot of people have held positions that you've held. And I think it's misunderstood. It's underappreciated. And it's rather spectacular.
Oh, thanks, man. I didn't. And just for the record, I did not pay him for that.
No. Ain't nothing here. This is for fun. I'm here to learn. I'm a student. But let's jump right into it. So you've had many roles in many places. We're going to get there. One of the last things you did was to be the Program Executive Officer, PEO, for Intelligence, Electronic Warfare, and Systems, IEW&S, in the Army. What no one who has understood an acronym would understand is that you were a member of a team that understood managed how billions was spent by the U.S. government for years.
Yeah.
There's a lot, I live in Silicon Valley. There's a lot of investors, a lot of entrepreneurs, patriots who don't understand how any of that's possible. It wasn't that long ago that even thinking about winning $1 million in the lottery, was something that would make the news. Now, what we're spending billions, but on an annual basis. Like the number of zeros on this is awesome.
Yeah, it's staggering at times, right?
It's staggering. Yeah. So that's just one of the jobs you've had. That's the teaser. We're going to come back to, I think, a bit of that topic, but maybe we can start a little bit separate. So how many years were you in the Army, sir?
Oh my goodness, 34 years and 5 months. That was spread over 4 decades, I guess, right? So the 80s, I enlisted, and then, of course, the 90s, came back in as an officer, and then obviously, yeah. So, 34 years over 4 decades, which is kind of scary.
What was your first job in those early days?
So as an enlisted guy, I was an artilleryman or a forward observer, right? So I was the guy calling for fire.
Call for fire. I've seen it.
Yep. And I kind of freaked my parents out because I originally went to college coming out of high school, right? And I was like, you know what, man? A good friend of mine told me about, the Army, how it helps you kind of grow, become a leader. And so I enlisted, thinking that, that would give me a good baseline if I ever did decide to kind of progress, that understanding what a soldier went through would be important, right? And so I did. And again, kind of freaked everybody out. And then about 2 years into that, or a little less than 2, I got what they call a green to gold ROTC scholarship, right? So they send enlisted guys back.
I've seen a lot of folks that did that. You all were the most intimidating people to be at ROTC because you're all these teenage kids going to college. You don't know the ranks. You don't know how to shine our shoes. And you're like, I've been doing this for 8 years, boy. Okay. Yeah. And all of you green to golds were so intimidating.
Yeah. Well, the funny part was my battery commander, when he brought me in, he's like, so Specialist Barker, congratulations. I'm happy you got this scholarship because you're such a smart ass. I was probably going to have to kick you out at some point. And I'm just, that was before Ron Burgundy was a thing, but I was like, oh, thanks. I'm Ron Burgundy, that type of thing. So, yeah.
It is funny, even in startup land, if someone's like just crazy enough to be infuriating, they may make a great CDO.
Yeah.
Like, and it's kind of like, this guy's trying to be crazy. Let's invest in him. Like, so there's that flip, right? That counterintuitive. I'm so grateful that led for your switch over. And then you've done many things since. But we have a little bit of a bookend here. So fire artillery, major acquisitions, and policy as well. As you look back over those 35 years, where's the slider bar in that? Were you then straight into the acquisitions world, straight up at the officer conversion, or did you see other forms of service along the way?
So one of the things I've always thought that the Army did that was pretty smart was they would branch detail officers, right? And so whenever I came back in, I fully expected they would probably put me in the artillery since that was my experience. And, in the Army, and their infinite wisdom says, let's make this guy an infantry guy. So yeah, so I ended up coming back as an infantry second lieutenant, Fort Benning, and then ended up at Fort Hood. And then even then I was branch detailed. So that was a method in which the Army had to get, the support functions like MI and others to give them officers that had, kind of combat arms experience. So 4 years as an infantry guy in first cav, so 2.5 cav, 2 live cav is what we called it sometimes. So a lot of NTC rotations, a lot of fun, and some of the formative years from a friendship. I mean, I'm still friends with a lot of those folks. But then they put me over into the MI world, so military intelligence, and another instance where I think it's smart of the Army to do those things, right? But then they decided to send me to echelon above corps, right? So I've been working in a battalion and a division and a brigade, and thinking, oh wow, they'll come me back, send me back to be an S2 or something, right, in a brigade, and not so quick, right? They decided to send me to the 513th MI down at Fort Gordon, so echelon above corps, and so, but that experience too was pretty remarkable when it comes to learning, right? And we were on a small intel flyaway team for General Franks at the time. It was the RSENT commander. So me and a E5 and a warrant officer, anywhere he went, we picked up and left, right? And so, but it was about that time that the acquisition piece, I kind of saw when it came to, really, what did I want to do kind of long term? I wanted to still make an impact, but I wanted to also kind of continue to learn and further my skill sets. And so when the acquisition opportunity presented itself to be assessed in the acquisition corps, I said, you know what, let's take a look at this, right? And that's what kind of led me down that path, right? And so after basically 8 or 9 years of infantry and MI, transitioned over to acquisition, and it's led us down that path.
That's fascinating. I mean, it's interesting. There's like a up, down, left, right coverage of your career from listed an officer from. And by the way, even though we're speaking Army a little bit here, I think even the average Navy SEAL are like, wait, is the division or brigade more senior? Like, I think there's a little bit of like. So I just want to extract from how I'm hearing the story. There was a operational shift in the echelon of decision making. There was some smaller tactical unit type things, but I think you said you got pulled up to more national assets and some level type things, even in the same rank and structure. So you had a kind of left, right, up, down exposure even before you got into the acquisition community. Is that a fair reflection?
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. So think of it from going, from that kind of battalion and company and squad up to, above corps, right? Above the corps, directly supporting, instead of supporting my battalion commander, we were supporting, Third Army and CENTCOM.
Right. Learn scope. I was in it, and I think the tools of the trade, when people think about and use, I'm learning just how cognitively different the tool set is at different echelons. I was in it this week where there's a lot of talk about drone swarms, and without naming names, there was a very senior, 3-4 star level conversation of drone swarms. Oh, that's a 04 or 5 thing. And other people are like, wait, what? Pretty sure you should care about it at that level. And but like this is kind of like, yeah, right. The look at your face says it. For those that are on YouTube watching, listening to this on other podcast platforms, there's a little bit of an eyebrow raising of, well, not necessarily. But my point of that anecdote is that the tools of the trade are different, and there's with evolving disruptive areas of technology, where does it fit becomes an interesting question. How much is delegated? How much is brought up? I want to. I guess there's a whole bunch of AI type questions, and whether you, I have a hunch, sir, you're going to say, "Oh, I'm not an AI expert," but I think you also have more expertise than you'll give yourself credit for. I want to go into like more of that in a bit, but I think that also touches on the later side of your career. I want to spend a little more time, almost more chronologically, in some of the earlier stuff you did, and I'm going to ask some questions in a sensitive topic. So if there's anything that's not appropriate, just say, yep, can't answer that. It's all good. It's all cool. But I think there's probably general things that'd be interesting to teach me and other folks about how to think about the world of acquisitions. For example, in my experience, I've worked for the White House. I know that you can't just go food shopping at one grocery store to bring groceries into the White House. That's obviously any nation would say, well, that's a bad plan. Every company has some diversification for that. You've done acquisitions earlier in your career for special groups. And buying for those folks is intelligence, is a secret. It's supposed to be. It's an element of the supply chain. But you did that for a long time, and I think you did that for a number of really interesting units. As you look back on the acquisitions for special stuff, how do you think about what that means for today's world of supply chain and the lessons learned from there, and consolidation and bad actors doing bad things? Just looking back on it, any stories that you can appropriately share, just for fun, about what it was like to work in that world?
I mean, there's a couple of ways to kind of approach that, right? So there's the fundamentals of almost kind of a leadership lessons, right? And then there's the kind of, blocking and tackling of doing the actual acquisition work, right? And so I was blessed, quite honestly. I was blessed. I was recruited to that organization to be the director of contracting. Essentially, I was a Charlie, what they call a Charlie contracting guy. I wasn't even a PM at the time. So I was recruited to be the deputy because they had, basically we're going to make the position a GS like 15 for this retiring lieutenant colonel. Things went south. Something happened. I'm not truly sure, but literally, I get there and within 30 days of getting there, they're like, okay, we're going to make the military, back to being the director. So yes, you were recruited to be the deputy, but now you're going to be the director. And congratulations, all these 14s and 15s now work for you. And you're a snot nosed 1 year time and grade major that,
Oh,
oh yeah. So it was a dynamic.
because a bureaucratic hack, for those that again don't speak all of these languages, the young person got in charge of a whole bunch of old salts, as we call them. Yeah. So congratulations, you're promoted. Now what do you do?
I know, right? Yeah. But that just kind of triggers those kind of interpersonal and those leadership skills, the soft skills that you have to do. But again, I was blessed. I got pulled in by guys, like, Brian Fenton, Mike Nagata, those types of people that, really kind of taught me the ropes when it came to, how to operate in that environment, right? I mean, a lot of times what you're being asked to do, there were many instances where there were no alternatives but to succeed, because, there's, life and death and, people in harm's way that were counting on you. So that was where I learned the phrase, no is the beginning of the conversation. Right. And you figure out a way to get things done. And, so I spent the better part of 6 years doing that. And, I always took a lot of comfort, coming home and you would see things on the news and know that that was probably attributed to something that you had a hand in. So you take a lot of comfort in that. So, but the other part of that is the blocking and tackling, so to speak, the acquisition work that had to be done. And most people would think that because you kind of live in that environment, that you had like, special rules and things like that. And it wasn't necessarily the case. I mean, there were definitely instances when you could leverage different authorities and stuff like that. But the reality is it came down to you had to know the rule book better, so to speak, because there were things that you would be asked to do on the acquisition side that either maybe wasn't fast enough or induced risk. And so you'd have to ask for waivers, right? You'd have to ask for a specific requirement or reclama, a step, enabled to. So you had to really know the rule book because you had to know what you needed not to do, right? And you needed the permission not to do it. And so you had to really groom your workforce to kind of live with that mindset. And just because it says you have to do it, doesn't mean you have to, but there's a waiver. And so it forces you really to become very knowledgeable when it comes to, the process, because you have to know where you need the exceptions, so to speak, to make those things happen. Right. And still stay in compliance, because despite living in that environment, you still had a lot of oversight, when you're talking about Title 10, Title 50, all those things, you had to be very, very conscious of that. And so, but looking back on it, I mean, those were some of my formative years. I mean, when it comes to the acquisition aspect of things, it taught me so much when it comes to, I don't want to use the term, I mean, it's kind of poetic, disruptive, right? But it taught me to not take no for an answer and to figure out a way to get things done. And that sometimes you gotta break things to make them better. So I like to think that those years really formed me and the leader that I eventually came, and throughout the subsequent acquisition assignments to kind of push the envelope and see what was done, the art of the possible, so to speak, and take chances, right? And and bet on good things happening by assuming a little more risk than you know maybe some people were tolerant of, I guess.
The admiration of the special operations community is warranted because the missions are so essential. End up perceiving risk differently, not as a reason to say no, but as a something to be managed to get to yes. There's that. Yeah, thank you for your concern. This is gonna happen in the next 24 hours. So
This is how we underwrite it.
it makes so much sense, honestly, the little that I know about you, just to hear you say those were formative years. Because it tends to go the other way. It tends to go as you get older in life, you take less risks in humanity. How that you went the other way. You say, I saw some risks, and let me know how to manage those through career. I don't think that's super normal. I haven't seen that as much. Well, there's an old joke that the person that has the most to lose is the one-star general because they know how much they're missing. Like, but you were kind of you leaned into it, and so it makes a little more sense given the extraordinary leadership that I know the way that you got swept up.
And the beauty of that is, I mean, I tried to instill that in, the officers that I worked with and that worked for me and stuff. I take a lot of comfort seeing, a lot of them doing some really, really good things today. So those investments that you make in soldiers and leaders and trying to groom them like that. So it was great.
Well, let's talk about that leadership. So another old phrase I learned from my time in government is that there's three forms of power in DC. You have a lot of people that work for you, chief of staff of the army, right? You have constituency, also known as Congress, or you spend a lot of money every year. That's a form of power. Three forms of power, as I was taught. I was taught by one of my old bosses. And I think you were in a position with a wonderful team and a wonderful building and a wonderful staff and extraordinary support, numerous labs. It was a very diverse ecosystem. But I think better you were looked to as a senior executive. So did you see that power coming in? Did you recognize it? Did you feel the weight of that kind of your decisions and the decisions of your team have had extraordinary consequences for national security? And frankly, I was wondering, did you realize that at the time? Because I think a lot of us on the outside were watching you in the number of folks who were just like, I wonder what they're going to decide. And we're talking, waiting for your decision. Did you feel that way? Did you see it? Did you know the consequence, particularly? It's all in like, we're in dynamic AI times. This week has had some AI news in many ways, not any specific political news. A lot of your earlier decisions and your team's decisions have led to the moments that we're still talking about in the news today. Did you see it back then? Did you know that it was coming?
To some degree, I think you had to, right? I mean, you know, you had to get comfortable living in an environment where, I used to call it organizational agility, and the ability to realize that the world under your feet is changing constantly, whether it's requirements and threat, resourcing, technology, and that old Moore's law thing. I mean, it was on when with an exponent, right? I mean, stuff was just happening so quickly. I think really coming out of really the NRO time was when you kind of start to see what was in the art of the possible when it came to leveraging things that were originally space based, as an example, and hey, can we put this on the ground and make it work, those types of things, right? And part of that was out of necessity because you saw what was coming.
Let's take our own data. So you're talking about 2010, 2013. Is that what your career?
Yep.
So we're at 2026. So 16 years ago, you felt the pace of technological change moving faster 15 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think even in the average tech person, like, 2000, I mean, we were just coming out of the financial crisis of 2008. Cloud was just starting to ramp up. People were talking big data back then. It felt like a shift to a enterprise model, but it didn't feel like a fundamental shift in I mean, from my perspective, it was like, yeah, same computer, but now it's in the cloud. Like, it didn't feel that different. You saw it differently?
Yes, I mean, I give you a really good example. We were doing a lot of things, reverse predators and things like that, right? And that was kind of the early stages of those. And if you recall, there was a hostage situation with a U.S. and a Dutch individual, and they were having a hard time. They were moving them around to the point where it was really hard to, get the proper identity to authorize anything, right? And part of that was the facial recognition aspect of things, right? And so we realized that, hey, with the onset of high definition cameras and things like that. And so we iterated really quickly over about a 2-week period to upgrade, specific components, on, between ground station and platforms and stuff to basically, have that HD capability, right? It was the onset of it. And I'll tell you, Ian, I think it was like within 17 minutes of the first flight, they had positive facial ID, and within a couple hours, the SEAL, they were rescuing those folks.
Actions were taken. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and so had we not realized the power of that technology and what it could do and how it could enable, they, who knows what the outcome would have been. But it was very in those early stages. You're like, man, we got it. Yeah, we have to figure out a way to embrace this, and how do you make it happen in a rapid manner? So, and that was and yeah. Anyways, that's an example of those early years and what we tried to do.
Yeah, and maybe I should I should stop being surprised by the. Well, okay, you say things need to move faster, and that they're for the things like requirements. You're referring to that. The pace of the sand is moving under our feet. Obviously, there is a broad recognition that the pace of change in software-driven activities, honestly, even manufacturing, but the Moore's law refers to a computing preference. What could be measured as the processing power. Processing power, you felt that over a decade ago. Now it feels like the processing power is itself going through transformations, probably commercially recognizable by the valuation of companies like NVIDIA and the battles between the frontier models and large language models, how they're getting better, faster, cheaper, the role of DeepSeek and how people are finding new austere ways to improve computing. It's an interesting battle space. Algorithmic warfare is getting to levels of faster competition. And there's so many places where I think you have experience here. I mean, really, what's interesting to you? You want to talk about, the algorithmic side of how people are using models forward, about how people are thinking about the pace, or even just the very structure is going to keep up. And rather than naming names, I mean, I'm looking at the moment now, and I feel like today's news, this week's news, and not to get too specific, I do feel like there's a Maven moment. I do feel like there's good questions about technology from 10 years ago, but rather than having good questions about the technology, people are freaking out with confusion and emotion and not really understanding what's really going on. Yeah, and it's on one hand, I feel like the adoption of new tech is not often as successful as the story you just told. On the other hand, I see a lot more military leaders now that are saying things with words like, my computer's at the edge, but my inference is in the cloud. I'm retraining on this platform, but I got the model of that platform. And I'm listening to these 3-4 star leaders going like, they even know what those words mean? Way to go. Okay. Because that wasn't the case 3 years ago. I couldn't even, that language was not understood. And I feel like everyone suddenly speaks Spanish. Like everyone suddenly knows that Spanish language. Like, what that means? Where did that come from? But so maybe it is. Maybe I should give more credit to the adoption of the pace of change. But I don't know. I'm wrestling, honestly wrestling with it. I don't know if folks in broadly the national security leadership already can keep up.
Yeah, I think and again, from a personal level, for me, I realized that I had to keep pace with those types of things, right? I had to understand, and whether it was when I went from soldier working tactical comms to enterprise information systems, and they're like, oh, we need you to migrate the ERPs to the cloud and put in a big data platform, and fundamentally, you're like, dude, what? I don't even know how to spell ERP, let . But that was kind of in the really early, when it came to cloud technology, the adoption and whatnot. So, but just something little like I knew that I had to learn, right? And so I took I think it was like a 12-week, data analytics course, through Wharton on my own, just to learn.
Really? They're already you can do it. You just do it on your own.
Yeah.
That's amazing. How are other military leaders learning this language? Is there like a proper AI school?
So I know the Army's invested a lot in a team up at Carnegie Mellon, right? I mean, so there's an AI and leading AI enabled organizations. There's another one that they do out of Johns Hopkins, which I've attended, and it's pretty impressive, right? And a lot of it is about enabling, business processes and stuff like that. What people don't always see is just the power of what that can do on the battlefield and intelligence, like ATR, automatic target recognition, and and being able to do things, at a pace that people never realized was possible.
How much of this is a gold rush trying to keep up with the latest fad versus an operational change? I heard a phrase this week that made me groan so loud the person next to me shushed me. Someone was talking about battlefield vibe coding. And I was like, oh,
Battlefield vibe coding.
yes. Yeah, you were the same face I made where I was like, oh, come on. What was intended by that, I think, was that in a couple of headquarters in certain combatant commands, a frontier LLMs like ChatGPT or Anthropic, or one of those tools was brought into the headquarters, and like the staff was the people that make briefs and PowerPoint presentations, whatever. A few months ago, it was brought in, and apparently the staff love it so much, you're never going to rip it out of that building. Big fancy thing with an admiral's mess and the whole thing. You never rip it out. They love
You
it.
sure it wasn't Battlefield prompt generation or something like that?
Even it should have been, but it was like I read the I was like, come on. But like the root of the question: how much is it as a fad? How much is it here to stay? Do people get it? Do they when they get an A? If you're a one-star general, you get told by you got to go to this AI-enabled something class at a wonderful university. Do you go awesome or like what this terrible thing? Like, what do you think the reception is to that new requirement?
I would say there's probably a mix, right? You got kind of the old dogs type, mentality. Then you also have others that realize that, it's not necessarily about you yourself being relevant. It's about trying to make sure that the organizations that you're leading and the workforce, remains relevant in the fight because it's not going away. I mean, the technology that's out there and the pace, it's not going away. It's only going to continue to get faster, right? And so the more tools you have in your kit bag, so to speak, right? When it comes to, you know, the tech side of things, the better off you're going to be, right? But yeah, I could, there's definitely folks that were there for the food, Carnegie Mellon always did a good job of feeding you and whatnot. So then there was, others there that was, definitely, how do you make the organization better? What's in the kind of the art of the possible? How do you, how can you enable this to, to free people up to do other things, right? Taking tasks off their plate to allow them to kind of think, right? That was my biggest thing as a commander throughout, different things, different echelons and different opportunities was, sometimes you just don't have the time to actually think, man, because you're moving so fast. And, sometimes it's just important to be able to like put your head back against the wall and say, okay, let me kind of think through this. So freeing people's minds up, the power of that is kind of huge, right?
There's a battlefield aspect of cognitive overload, information advantage, decision advantage. In your career, I hope it's fair to say that you had the cognitive overload of capabilities flying at you faster than anyone could even describe what the hell they were. And requirements trying to keep up on a 5-year process that is laughable compared to the cycle time of a typical frontier model. And I think, and at least in my life, the pace of change is faster. And you saw that until very recently, when you separated, retired relatively recently. So, how did you, as a commander, manage information space of how to direct folks to make fair and equitable procurement acquisitions, selections? Like you bought, let's get a non-adjacent category to provide the analogy. Like if you choose a certain vendor to build an aircraft carrier, you're going to get a certain kind of aircraft carrier. Like there's implications of hiring a person to do a job. If you hire a plumber to do an electrician's job, what do you think's going to happen? Right? Like there's some of that in life, and your consequences for similar decisions were massive, billion-dollar, multi-year, 10-year impacts to a bad decision on a thing with incomplete information coming at you and your teams. How did you approach that? It's a acquisition. Like, how do you think about
I think where we saw success, right, was we started to enable tools like OTAs and things like that. The things that allowed us to rapidly iterate when it came to those requirements, right, and adjust based on soldier feedback, demonstrations, touch points, where we would go out and have soldiers use kit, right, and that kind of iterative process before you kind of slap the table on what you were finally going to buy was crucial, right? And I think it's those instances where we saw success, right? And then you had other programs that were probably operating off of what they call a major capability acquisition pathway, had a requirements document that was 7+ years old, and you just did not get necessarily, you just didn't get relief from that, right? And so you kind of had to build something that you knew probably wasn't what was needed at the time. And so you had to have the guts, right? You really had to have the guts to go back and say, listen, this is just not a wise investment now. And I did that a couple of times towards, I know in my last year, telling, senior leaders, we have to stop this. This is, I mean, it's going to give you what's prescribed, in that document, but it's not going to meet what the warfighter needs. And so pivoting at this point is absolutely the right thing to do. And we saw that in Ukraine. I mean, you immediately realized that some of the things that we were doing would not be survivable. and we had to pivot. And, and while it's great to be able to stand up and say that something's working and is going to be fantastic, it takes more guts to say this is not going to work, and to kind of tell truth to power and walk away.
Yeah, it's very powerful. Like, I'm sweating just listening to you tell the story because, like, it feels a level. I've been in the rooms. I was a acquisition official. I was a buyer of things. That was tables, and I'm having an emotional moment just thinking through. Look, one of my closest advisors, mentors, teachers, partners is some of them are very deep in the requirements generations process. Their job is there's a level of need and a historic obligation for what they're doing. And it sounds like what you're saying. Sometimes that is a liability, not a strength. Sometimes the requirement written 8 years ago is something that should responsibly be challenged.
Yeah, 100%.
I'm paraphrasing.
No, that is exactly what you should do.
Whole job impacting it's a provocative state.
Yeah, you have to challenge that. I mean, especially if it's not relevant. Especially if whether it's from a data aspect, or it's just not survivable, you name it, right? Not interoperable, not open, right? Kind of going down the lockbox type approach. But
You've never said this to anybody in your situation. I wish you were back in uniform, because like that kind of leadership is so needed. Look, there's a lot of startups that watch this podcast. A lot of folks get told on a monthly basis, beautiful product, life-saving, but there's no requirement for it. And because it's a requirement for it, sorry, buddy, you cured cancer, I can't help you.
Yeah. And that's the old mindset, right? And that's the shit that used to drive me crazy. And so, definitely over the latter part of my career, I started pushing on people, and I was like, don't let those words come out of your mouth. Okay. I promise you, there's something either implied that you could put the hooks into to at least see what's in the art of the possible, and a lot of time, and there was a couple times when that was, legacy kit, that may have not been relevant again, but they had some hooks from a data standpoint and the ability to be able to share. And, if you had made a minor investment, it, made their capability more relevant on the battlefield because it could be interoperable and provide value added to a modern software architecture, right? So getting people to understand that and assume a little risk, there were a couple times it took multiple conversations, but yeah, you have to push people. You have to push them to get them to kind of embrace that type of, because they have this, there's a self-protection thing, right? And it's getting them to understand that you're going to underwrite their risks. You're going to underwrite, if it fails, great. I'm the one that asked you to do it. And I got your back. Okay. So, but I would rather you run fast and fail early than to never get to the finish line.
So I think the future of the technology acquisitions broadly, all the forces, all the branches, because the technology is moving so fast, it's like there's not going to be singular expertise in a category. It's like someone claiming they're an expert in the Middle East. Yeah, are you really? Like, this is no such thing. Like, I'm an expert in AI. No, you're not. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of folks that the specialization is inevitable. There's competing interests. The pace of change is broadly faster. People are questioning the foundations of jobs and kids' education in this modern economy. There's when the computer can do math better than any human, why are we there's a lot of good questions. How are you teaching that? So the requirements impact of that. Like, this is a disruptive moment, and I think anything that touches this, any of the evolving dynamic categories, robotics, field production, AI, frontier, there's a bunch, hypersonics, a bunch that are changing at unusual speeds. And I think those are much harder to have a requirement for by definition. The cycle time, there's a cycle time of effects in the field. There's a cycle time of requirements to acquisitions to Capitol Hill. I think that those cycle times, none of the ones I described are as fast as we want them to be.
No, even if the requirement can change that fast, Ian. I mean, you can have all these documents, and the Army's trying to do better, man. They are trying.
Yeah, then we got to do credit, massive bureaucratic overall. We haven't talked about the PAE architecture. Oh my goodness.
Capability needs. I mean, everybody's trying to move and they're trying to do the right thing. They're trying to take a more iterative approach, and I think that's definitely something we should applaud. I did. I mean, I trumpeted it. Like, I was a big fan of the OTAs, and as we started down the path of CSOs and whatnot, I mean, it gave you that, right? So, but there's a back end piece of it that for the rest of the institution, that kind of rest of the the installation, the training, the schooling, all that has to keep pace, right?
It has. I'm going to read just this week. Like, I'm loving OTA. We've never done one, so we're not going to. It's like, God, this one.
And it's that naivety that is just maddening, right? Maddening, so.
It's a fight worth fighting, I do think. And it's maddening for us, but I think you and I haven't gone that far from this world because we're trying to still make it better, albeit from a different perspective. It's this like acquisition warfare is a funny piece. It's as essential as the capabilities coming forward, famously covered by, folks like the Ash Carter book and others that, the military, the Army doesn't manufacture bullets, it procures bullets. So therefore, like right there, you're defining how we actually fight warfare. It is evolving and highly disruptive. I obviously living in an AI space, I'm seeing a piece of the elephant, but I guess I am ambitious for some of the recognition and changes. That the top line change of what to fight for has to happen first, and hopefully the infrastructure, the training, the number of contracting officers in government, all of that hopefully follows. But I think it starts with that, for better or for worse, top down leadership. It's like, hey, here's the new direction. Now start moving. Do you have ambitions and hope, or I should say optimism, not ambitions? Do you have optimism for where these things are going? It sounds.
I do. Yeah, I do think there's opportunity, right? I know, like, this kind of reshaping across the board. The thing is, it's going to need time to stabilize, right? It's going to need time to for everybody to kind of find what their new role is, how they operate in those spaces. Fundamentally, the biggest challenge when it comes to operating in this world is the fact that priorities change, resourcing changes, and it just undercuts the very premise of some of the things you're doing, because you thought you were planning on one thing and now you're going to get another. You thought the standard was this and now it's that. I mean, so that part can be a little frustrating, but I do think that, from a optimism standpoint, people are realizing that, that the mechanisms that we're putting in place, ideally it's going to be able to foster that type of change, right? The thing away, I think we're going to have to always remember, when you're trying to operate at speed and, and interoperability and things along those lines, there's always going to be trade-offs, right? And so you're going to have to figure out, just because you may have something that is the best thing, right? And maybe it optimizes this specific function, okay? But if you don't understand truly how that fits into the larger picture, I mean, if it sub-optimizes another area, then that's definitely not good, right? So, but you really want to understand that kind of holistic approach and how it can optimize and enable the rest of the system, or the capability itself, the architecture to go faster or be more accurate, those types of things. So I mean, as you kind of measure those opportunities, you got to understand where what you're offering kind of fits in that space. Does that make sense?
It does, and it makes me think that your new adventure with your new day job is a great example of how translating and teaching, translating and teaching how to do those things is a job that AI cannot replace. You cannot scale trust. It has to be earned over time, and there's nuance. Your job is quite secure. Because no LLM can do what you just said, because there is that level of trust, which is, I would ever say, if anything, more valuable now, because software creation, AI creation, technology creation is being cheaper. It's becoming commoditized as the disaster occurs and other things like it's covered in just recent weeks. And therefore, your ability to navigate these dynamics is increasingly more valuable. So I'm grateful to learn from you. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to ask you some silly questions about a world that I'm obsessing over but can barely understand. Final question as we round off this little podcast. You've spent many years in acquisitions. I have a stupid question for you. Can I ask you a question? What is the total number of dollars pushed through your responsibilities over your many years of acquisitions? Like, if I did a cocktail napkin up, I spent $100 last year and $200 the year before. Have you ever actually done that math? Just for fun?
Never. I mean, it depends on what role you're sitting
Yeah,
in.
just anything that should touch. Not like that you read in the newspaper, like, oh, I worked on that. Anything like that. You never, just for fun, you ever looked at something like that? Because it's insane, whatever that number is.
Yeah, I imagine it's up there. I mean, if I just think back to like my ASAult chief of staff days and
Oh, man, that's the goal argument. No, like,
anything that the AE signed, essentially went across my desk to some degree. So you're talking about
that's got hundreds of billions. I mean, it's like the Army's budget. Based on the Army, the acronym, it's the Army's acquisition leader.
Basically the RDA account, right? So
I mean, that last year, RD, I want to say 300 billion. No, Army. I need to break it down. I think it's joint. It's yeah. That's what the number is. Just is what it's an impossible. But ironically, maybe that is an example of something that AI could probably figure out. I'll ask that question. What? Based on this resume of this LinkedIn profile of this retired general, how much money did this person? It probably give you a pretty good answer for that. We'll save that for another demo. I'm just, again, I said at the beginning, it's a stupid question.
No, it makes you think, right? Because I'm sure it's up there.
And ultimately, it's not how you actually measure a career. It's the impacts of course, and you've taught me this, not just the capabilities brought forward, but I had the rare privilege of observing as a person in the back of the room your retirement ceremony, and that question was not on the stage. What was on that stage was heartfelt, personal, emotional stories about the people you've served with, the family that has stood by your side, the extraordinary number of who's who of leaders across national security, active and retired. They were grateful for your years of dedicated service. And they didn't want to see you leave.
You're going to make me tear up. You're going to make me tear up.
I was tearing up in the bed. Like just the folks that were able to articulately describe how their lives have been changed because of you. That's the real measurement of a career. That was one of the most dynamic experiences that I've observed in working in national security in the past few years. I mean, it was both. Maybe it's that level of personal commitment and transformation, while also the business of government is hard, and you've led it for many years. But now you're in a new adventure, which we can get to celebrate in other ways. Anyway, Ed, thank you.
Ian, thank you for having me.
Thank you for sharing some stories. Any final words of perspective or any encouragement? If folks want to catch up with you, where should they find you?
Obviously, I'm on LinkedIn. You can hit me up there. What I will tell you, just you guys, in the business that you're in right now, you're pushing the envelope when it comes to, phenomenal amounts of change, right? And so don't let up. Okay. Don't let up. Keep pressing, because it goes back to those soldiers and those people. I mean, you have the ability to kind of make a significant impact. And I'm very, very proud to know you. Very proud that you were there that day, and to be a part of all of that. And just grateful that, that I can hit you up while I'm sitting in a bar and you're in an airport. And
look, it was service like yours makes me feel like I need to work hard. And so with that, we'll end the podcast and then get back to work. But thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Take care.